Oh boy, everyone, we're taking the 8 values test. Now, this is a test that I've taken for a long time. I've routinely taken the 8 values test like once every few months for the last 2 years because I find it interesting to understand where it is that my political stance or just values in general are heading because I've gotten so many different results on this test that I find it really fascinating to keep updating my results on it. You will be presented with a series of statements. For each one, click the button with your opinion on it. Okay. Oppression by corporations is more of a concern than oppression by governments. Um, a lot of the time, governments are on the side of corporations, and so they're kind of putting both hands in one another to, uh, you know, to do the oppression. So a lot of the time, the government is just an arm of the corporation's oppression themselves. So I would say that because that coercive element exists, then yeah, because if a corporation is going to, be causing mass poverty and making it to where people can live worse, then I would say that that's a bad thing. It is necessary for the government to intervene in the economy in order to protect consumers. I strongly agree. If, companies are putting like sawdust or something in cereal, we need to stop that. The freer the markets, the freer the people. If you look at most countries around the world that have tried freer and freer markets, they've usually failed. I don't think dying is necessarily a way to be free. Most, if not all, countries that have tried to have the freest markets in the world have universally failed, so I would say no to that. It is better to maintain a balanced budget than to ensure welfare for all citizens. It's possible to do both. You can have a balanced budget and ensure the welfare of all citizens. Generally speaking, the societies that have existed that have prioritized welfare have been more effective economies. So I would say I strongly disagree with this. Publicly funded research is more beneficial to the people than leaving it to the market. There was a study that was done, an article put out by The Guardian kind of summarizing a lot of the information that came out with the fact that most innovations that are made, in fact the majority of innovations that are made, are actually as a result of state funding and the government, because the market tends to be ineffectual in terms of producing innovations because it's a risk. It is a ginormous risk for the market to be building new and innovative things, and so publicly funded research gives more leeway to do things effectively and to do more bigger and stranger ideas, to try more things, whereas in the market it's more of a risk. So I would say, given the fact that history has shown us that publicly funded research has given most of our innovations that we have, I would agree with that. International trade is beneficial. I think everyone should trade with one another because it leads to nations being more peaceful, so I would strongly agree. From each according to his ability to each according to his needs. I feel like the problem with this statement, and problem with communists using it as a principle, is that what it's talking about here is possible under a capitalist system. You could reform a capitalist system to do exactly what this is describing. So I don't think this is inherently a communistic idea. I think it's more about, building a society where the jobs that people have access to effectively fulfill their needs and give them fulfillment in life, which I think is possible under a capitalist system, so I would agree. It would be best if social programs were abolished in favor of private charity. Generally speaking, private charity doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't help people because not enough people are willing to actually do it, so you have to hold larger corporations accountable. So I'd completely disagree with that. Taxes should be increased on the rich to provide for the poor. Absolutely. I don't think people should be this rich. There's no reason for it. if someone is going to have $100 billion, what are they going to do with that? Obviously, they should have money to invest more in their business and to build more things, but there comes a point when you have such an absurd amount of money that you just don't need that much. I don't have a problem with millionaires existing, for instance, because I believe even if you have a socialist-oriented economy, it should have market elements. I'm not even entirely opposed to those people, but when you get people with an insane amount of wealth, there's no reason. Generally, poor people are disadvantaged on a systemic level, is that they don't have access to better conditions, is that they can't necessarily pull them up and make their lives better. So I would strongly agree with that. Inheritance is a legitimate form of wealth. Um, I mean, I don't know an answer to that question, because on the one hand, if someone inherits too much, then, they didn't work for that at all. They didn't build anything in order to attain that. Um, but at the same time, should they have the freedom to inherit that wealth, and to what degree how much of it should they inherit? It's kind of a nuanced issue. Uh, I'm gonna have to softly disagree. Public utilities like roads and electricity should be publicly owned. I strongly agree. Excessive government intervention is a threat to the economy. Um, Generally speaking, government intervention has strongly helped the economy. FDR was the reason we got out of the Great Depression, the New Deal, the reason, Norway hasn't had a financial crash since World War II is because of government intervention. You look at a country like China, the most government intervention in almost any economy, and they're constantly growing, constantly building themselves up as a country in a relatively short span of time. So I think history and general research and statistics proves this statement to be incorrect. Those with a greater ability to pay should receive better health care. I don't think anyone should receive better health care, quote unquote. If they want to get their own health care, to pay for their own health care, they should be allowed to do that, but they shouldn't receive better health care. Everyone should receive health care that's at the same level of effectiveness, because you shouldn't have other people who are taken more care of when it comes to something as life-threatening as health insurance. Quality education is the right of all people. Absolutely agree. You can't have an effective democracy without effective education. Everyone should have the right to use education to build themselves up as a person and have a better life and a happier life as a human being. The means of production should belong to the workers who use them. I believe the problem with this statement is that it isn't in favor of some private property existing. Like, obviously worker co-ops are inherently more effective. Like, we can see with companies like Dragon, one of the top 10 companies in Spain. It's a worker co-op. It's extremely effective. There's no reason for the managers and bosses of these companies to be making as much as they do. And when you design the workplace to be democratically owned, it's much more effective. The workers feel much more fulfilled, and it does better work. And so I would say, yes, I agree with this statement, but I would not be in favor of the abolition of all private property in favor of creating a society entirely based on worker co-ops. I think there should be a coexistence of them. And in the case of privately owned business, I think the people who are in charge of them should have at least half of the members of the board for the company should be elected by the workers in that company. So, even for privately owned business, they should have democratic elements, like co-determination in Germany, for instance. I think is a very good law to democratize the workplace further. So I would agree. The United Nations should be abolished. The thing with the United Nations is that the reason it exists is so other countries, don't end up doing genocides and stuff. So I think countries should be held to international standards to not do things like that. The problem is that you get a country like the U.S., and they exert overdue power to other nations where they don't follow the rules that they're exerting on other people. You know, John Bolton once said that international law is a tool in our toolbox. In other words, it's only used to further regime change and the interests of the United States, but it's not something that the United States has to abide by. So I don't really understand why the UN is necessarily useful when some of the biggest members don't even follow it. But if the UN was more effective, I would be totally in favor of it. So I would have to disagree that it should be abolished. Military action by our nation is often necessary to protect it. I don't see a point in invading other countries. And other countries tend to not be a threat to us. Invasion generally should not ever be an option because the land should be by the people, for the people. It is the right of the people to self-determine their own nation. It is not our place as a country to use military action to force them to be a certain way. That is wrong. The land belongs to the people who use it. So, if the country in question is directly attacking us, or, a very important ally, or is, doing something like a genocide, I would say yes, but I don't think it's often necessary, so I'd have to strongly disagree. Imperialism is bad. I support regional unions such as the European Union. I don't support the European Union because it leads to the countries that it's in being less democratic. So the European Union, as an institution, brings about the wealth to be concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer individuals. So someone in Germany, for instance, a German banker, German capitalist, he can have access to all these resources and land in Greece or in Bulgaria, but the people of those countries aren't going to be able to nationalize those resources. They aren't going to be able to use those resources to build up their economy. The money is just going to be in the hands of someone in another country. It is the literal definition of imperialism. It's disregarding the national sovereignty of other nations in order to impose international rules that they should not have to follow. And those rules themselves tend to benefit only the larger countries in the European Union that ultimately lead to undemocratic elements of the European Union kind of flooding into these other countries and ultimately taking away the grip that those countries have on their own country and infringing on their national sovereignty. So I would say no, I do not support them. A united world government would be beneficial to mankind. If the world was united as one government, in a utopian, great world, it would be. But the problem is that we live in a world where we don't necessarily know what would be the ideal system, given the conditions of specific countries. I feel like the national sovereignty of those countries should be up to them. But if those countries had all collectively decided we need to be in one world government, and all of the same best policies that we could do theoretically were applied or adapted towards their context, it would be because everyone would be on the same page and we could effectively tackle climate change and stuff. But that's in a very utopian scenario. So I would have to very, tangentially agree, but also I'm not entirely sure, so I'm going to pick neutral. It is more important to retain peaceful relations than to further our strength. I agree. I don't see a reason to flaunt your imperial power. I think it's better for the entire world to be peaceful and cooperate. Wars do not need to be justified to other countries. If you're not going to justify them to other countries, then you have who are you accounted to? The people of your own country, that's one thing, but I feel like there should be other people involved who, act as a check and balance and should give you criticism. I, the international community is affected by all of these wars. They're affected by all of these ripples that go on throughout the world. And so our allies and other countries around the world, if we want to trade with them and remain having peaceful relations, then we also need to justify our war efforts in other countries, or straight up just not go to war at all the way that I would prefer. So I would strongly disagree with this. Military spending is a waste of money. I strongly agree. International aid is a waste of money. I mean, the international aid helps people. It leads to lives being better, so I don't know why that would be a waste of money if it's decreasing the pain in the world, bringing about more pleasure. My nation is great. I strongly disagree. I don't like my country very much. Research should be conducted on an international scale. Strongly agree. If you're not researching everywhere with all of these different minds, putting them all together, then you're only going to have a narrow view of the world. You need to be cooperating at the international scale to achieve truly great things. Government should be accountable to the international community. Strongly agree. Even when protesting an authoritarian government, violence is not acceptable. I'd have to strongly disagree with this. Is that, for example, in India, people say that Gandhi was the reason why Indians gained independence, but that's not even true. The reason they gained independence was because there were a lot of violent protesters and revolutionaries who said, we need to make a society for the Indian people that is not imposed on us by a foreign power, but made by us, the people who own the land. So I think violence can often get rid of authoritarian and imperial powers, and violence can often be very justified in the case of, getting rid of occupying governments. So I would have to disagree with that. My religious values should be spread as much as possible. I don't really have religious values, but if you would define atheism as being that, then I would say no, because my values are my own and therefore they are subjective. I shouldn't force other people to believe the same things as me. Our nation's values should be spread as much as possible. If the values are good, then sure, you should be telling other people to be the same way because the values are good. But when it comes to personal things like religion, it's a bit too personal. It's the same thing with what one would define as a value. If I said, for example, gay people should be allowed in every country. Well, that's my stance, but the society of people who make up the nation should be the ones who decide that. If by spread we mean encourage, then of course we should encourage to adopt our mindset because we believe in our mindset. But if one becomes too forceful, then that would be imperialism and thought policing, which I would disagree with. It is very important to maintain law and order. I think as long as you build a system where people can be happy and healthy, you don't have to maintain law and order because people would just be happy with the system they have. So just make a better system and you wouldn't have to be so authoritarian. The general populace makes poor decisions. In the current conditions that we have, yes, but the reason why is because the system that we live under has made people this way. The system that we live under has caused people to make poor decisions. And so if we lived under a better system and made a better system, then that wouldn't be the case. I really don't like this demonization of normal people that a lot of political pundits have, because normal people aren't so different than you and I. It's just that they need to be pushed in the right direction, and if you have respectful discussions with them, their beliefs can be understood even if you disagree. So I would have to disagree with this. I think we should cooperate instead of, trying to be against one another. Victimless crimes such as drug use should not be crimes at all. Strongly agree. The sacrifice of some civil liberties is necessary to protect us from acts of terrorism. That's a really broad question. I don't think you should get rid of civil liberties, but if your government is going to be overthrown, potentially, then I would say I agree with that, but I don't think there's a lot of separatist movements that would be terrorists that would say, we have to split off into our own country. Usually they're talking about putting people on the terrorist watch list, monitoring your internet security and stuff. I'm opposed to that, so I would have to disagree. Government surveillance is necessary in the modern world. I completely disagree. It is in my constitutional rights to not be watched by my government. I have a right to privacy. Everyone should. The very existence of the state is a threat to our liberty. If the state is owned by and ran by the people, then it's free. You can have a free state, it just has to be run by the people. Regardless of political opinions, it is important to side with your country. If you only side with your country, then that's suppressing criticism. Is that you should always be critical of your country. You should always have an open mind and try to look at things from a different perspective. Doesn't mean change your values necessarily, but always be considering the other side. Be open to other points of view. If you just dogmatically side with your country, you're not going to make any real change. You have to be making real change based on the assessments you've made of all the information. No authority should be left unquestioned. I strongly agree. This is why in an effective democracy we would have checks and balances. A hierarchical state is the best. I think the people should be given as much power as possible in the governmental and democratic process, so I would say no. It is important that the government follows the majority opinion even if it is wrong. It depends on what stage of development you're talking about. Like, if, for example, you try to build up a democracy in a feudalist third world country, then the majority opinion isn't going to be super great. You kind of have to build up schooling and industry and stuff, and then after that you can more effectively implement democratic processes. If it's a first world country where you've, reformed the system to such an extent with the resources that you have available that an effective democracy where people are informed can exist, then of course. But I think it's a bit of a nuanced question where obviously, ideally, you should always follow the majority opinion because that's the nature of democracy, which is the best system. But at the same time, if a country is unevenly developed, then you're going to have a lot of very dangerous people who are going to try to vote. So I would say on a philosophical level I agree with this, but it depends on, in the pragmatic sense, it depends on what the conditions are, whether we should completely follow it. The stronger the leadership, the better. Depends on what you would define as strong. If you mean strong as in good and doing a good job, yes. But if you mean strong as in dictatorship, then no. I'm assuming this means dictatorship, so I'd have to strongly disagree. Democracy is more than a decision-making process. I mean, everything is a decision-making process, but democracy is a human right. It's part of our very being. So I would agree. Environmental regulations are essential. Yeah, climate change is killing the planet, of course. A better world will come from automation, science, and technology. I agree. As the world develops and automation automates more jobs, it'll free people up to do more things that they care about and to pursue other goals. Technology will just make life easier, and that is good for humanity. Children should be educated in religious or traditional values. I think a secular state is ideal where religious and traditional values are left out of the curriculum because it should be free to the individual to decide what it is that they believe. Traditions are of no value of their own. I think it depends on the context. Like, traditions in and of themselves do not have value inherently, but certain traditions can have value depending on the context. But inherently speaking, no, they do not, so I would agree. Religion should play a role in government. No, we should have freedom of religion. Anyone could be able to be in a religion, but we should not make our government based on that religion because it suppresses the freedoms of other religions. So I would disagree. Churches should be taxed the same way other institutions are taxed. I strongly agree. A lot of churches don't use the money that they're getting for donative causes. They're not using them to build the world in a better way. They're just kind of using them to line the pockets of these big televangelists. So a lot of these people, they own private jets and stuff. Of course you should tax them. They're not making their money through an honest way. They're just tricking people, saying, give me money for God, but it's only to advance their own wealth. Climate change is currently one of the greatest threats to our way of life. I mean, there was a UN report that came out that said, in the next 10 years, the effects of climate change are going to be irreversible. Look at the sea levels. Look at all of the natural disasters that are happening right now, of course. It is important that we work as a united world to combat climate change. Of course, we're talking about the death of the planet here. Society was better many years ago than it is now. I think technological and historical progress will always be a good thing. So to say that it was better many years ago, back when gay people were thrown out in the street and when we didn't have advanced computers and stuff, I think that's very wrong. We can have the potential to make an even better world now that we have better technology and better social rules, social guidance that leads to more people being free than they could before. It is important that we maintain the traditions of our past. If those traditions don't have value in and of themselves, why maintain them? It is important that we think in the long term beyond our lifespans. I agree, because, our children, they're going to have to live in a world, and it's important. Reason is more important than maintaining our culture. Absolutely. If something is unreasonable, then don't do it. Drug use should be legalized or decriminalized. I strongly agree. The legalization of drugs would lead to more taxable income, which could be put into more social programs. The people who do drugs do it as a choice. They want to do it. But for the people who are kind of peer pressured or marginalized into it, there should be consistent education throughout schools and so on to keep people from doing drugs that they don't understand. But it should ultimately be a personal choice, despite the rigorous education that we would have in place to prevent, drug use without the necessary knowledge of what it is that they're doing. So I would say yes, legalize, decriminalize, keep those people out of jail. That's more tax money we can put towards better things. And have free rehabilitative centers for all the drug abusers, because ultimately, a lot of the time, it's as a result of sickness and mental illness that cause these problems, so we should be working to rehabilitate them rather than criminalize them. Same-sex marriage should be legal. Absolutely, it is the right of gay individuals, trans individuals, and so on to be able to exercise their freedom as individuals, and they should be able to marry one another. There's no difference. Like, what's the difference between a heterosexual marriage and a same-sex marriage? There's no difference. Like, they're just people who love each other, and they should have the freedom to do what they want. No cultures are superior to others. I would have to strongly disagree with that, because Saudi Arabia exists, and they are a Sunni Wahhabist government which funds groups like ISIS, al-Nusra, and al-Qaeda, which lead to the destruction of the lives of many women and children and LGBT people, which is obviously bad as a culture. So I would completely disagree. Some cultures are better than others, because some cultures aren't willing to put children into child sex slavery, Sex outside of marriage is immoral. I think marriage is a socially defined abstract concept, so I don't think we can really say that it's immoral. If the two individuals who are together decide that they would be okay with having sex outside of marriage, then that is the choice of those individuals, and it is within their rights and their freedom to do so. So I would disagree. If we accept migrants at all, it is important that they assimilate into our culture. I mean, obviously, if you're talking about people who come from a more violent place, then of course they should assimilate, because we don't want violence in our country. Abortion should be prohibited in most or all cases. It should be the right of women to control their own body. I don't think the government should at all have any affairs in what women want to do with their body. That is their right, and it should be within their freedom to make sure that they don't have a kid. Government should not force people to have kids, especially rape and incest victims. Gun ownership should be prohibited for those without a valid reason. I completely disagree. I believe it is the right of the people to take up arms and fight against tyrannical governments. If the government became fascist, then the people should have guns to fight against that government. They should have artillery. They should have training with weapons, active knowledge on the subject, and guns should be deregulated. There should be more guns instead of less of them. The way that you stop gun violence is by having a better culture of educating people, making them happier, giving them better mental health resources. The people who tend to shoot up places are the people who have been alienated by their society, people who didn't have a good upbringing, didn't have access to the proper mental health resources. It's not the cause of guns, and to restrict guns is to restrict the freedom of the common man. I support single-payer universal health care. I completely agree. If we were to truly live in a free society, every man and woman and child should be covered by health care. Even if you're dirt poor on the street homeless, you should not die. Because if you died and didn't have health care, or if you had to spend thousands in debt to have health care, you are not free as an individual. You're a slave to the system that forces you to make as much money as possible to pay your medical bills. And I think if people are going to be free to pursue their interests and to live the life that they want, they need to have health care. That is a human right. Prostitution should be illegal. I completely disagree. It should be the right of the people seeking the prostitutes to seek them, and prostitutes should be allowed on the free market to do their business. That is ultimately their choice, and their freedom to make that choice is what is the most important. Maintaining family values is essential. It depends on what you define as family values. If you mean people not hitting their kids and stuff, obviously yes. But if you mean like forcing people to be religious and stuff, no. I would say that, obviously we should have values and standards, so I would agree. To chase progress at all costs is dangerous. Obviously, if you chase progress by causing a genocide, absolutely. So I would agree. Genetic modification is a force for good, even on humans. There's some nuances with this. Obviously, if there's a big risk with genetic modification, we shouldn't do it. But if you can make genetic modification safe and use it to better our scientific progress, make humans smarter and stronger, then yes, I would agree. We should open our borders to immigration. Well, I mean, if we get so many migrant workers, then we're not going to be able to take care of all of them. We should be focusing on taking care of the people within our borders first and foremost. But immigration in general, yes, I think having foreign workers come in is generally beneficial to the economy and the strength of a country. But if you just bring in everybody, I think that's very dangerous. Governments should be as concerned about foreign citizens as they are with those within their own borders. I disagree. I think we should take care of our own people first. All people, regardless of factors like culture or sexuality, should be treated equally. I strongly agree. If we were to have an effective, strong democracy, everyone, even prisoners, even LGBT people, they would all be treated the same and allowed a vote and a fair place in society. So I'd strongly agree. It is important that we further my group's goals above all others. I mean, if I believe in what it is that I'm saying, then of course I would want to further my group's goals, because those are my principles, that's what I care about. But if the people collectively decide that my goals are incorrect, then they should have the democratic right to do so. But obviously I believe in my group's goals, so yeah, of course we should further them. Just don't infringe on the rights of others. Oh boy. who Lord, what did I get? Closest match, libertarian communism. I don't even identify as a communist. On the civil axis, I got libertarian, 82.7% of liberty. Diplomatic axis, I am peaceful. And then economic axis, it says I am a socialist. So I'm still kind of in favor of markets, which is true. I don't think we should abolish markets entirely, which would literally make me not a Marxist by a lot of people's definitions. Um, Obviously, I'm very progressive. I think personal freedoms and scientific progress is very important. So, according to this, according to this, I'm a libertarian communist. Wow. I don't even identify as a Marxist myself, even though I do support a lot of formerly existing and currently existing Marxist governments and their right to exist, their struggle to create a socialist economy. I may support them, but I don't agree with a lot of the things that they're doing. That's one of the reasons why I myself don't identify as a communist, because I think that that's one way that we can achieve societal progress. But I also think reforming the current system that we have is another way. And I believe, if done correctly in both forms, it is possible to do so. The thing with my country, America, is that so often the democracy is actively suppressed in the name of capitalist interests. And so, within the current system we have, until we drastically change the way our democracy functions, they're going to keep on cheating certain politicians or suppressing the vote. And so, that is, in some ways, a product of private property. But we see other governments around the world that do have very thriving democracies under the capitalist system. So I believe those are things that we can learn from. And I don't think the system we live under is inherently unreformable, but it would take a hell of a lot of work to do it properly. And I think the communist governments around the world have the right idea, but I don't believe in their more authoritarian practices, despite the fact that I do realize that a lot of those more authoritarian practices are as a result of the historical necessity to preserve their country. Because when you've got all of the missiles pointed at you, from Western allies, then it's going to make you much more likely to want to crack down on dissent in your country. And I can understand that, despite the fact that I disagree with it on an ideological level. I can understand why that would occur in order to preserve the existence of your country and to further the goal that it is, that you have in place. And so I do side with them a lot of times, even though I don't necessarily even agree with them ideologically. So I think it's about nuance, how it is that you define your political views. And with that, I'll probably do another one of these tests tomorrow.